come from, where we are a little bit today, and a little bit also about video game studies. It's really interesting to be here because I've never really been in a conference where we've talked about music, which is so playful, and then kind of the connection with games. And so it's really exciting for me to be here because I'm learning so much. And I'm hoping to bring you some value in terms of like an overview of kind of this industry, which is budding and growing, but running into some obstacles. So I'm going to try to expose you to both of those. Before I start, I'd like to just ask you a quick question. Who considers themselves to be a gamer? You can raise your hand. There's an American from California who founded the Institute of Play. His name is Dr. Stuart Brown. And he did a lot of research into games and relationship with games. And what he found was, through listening to a lot of stories of serial murderers, was that when they were growing up, they didn't really have a successful relationship with play, but they didn't have a relationship at all with play. So I'm going to ask you that question again. Who considers themselves to be a gamer? And when I say games, I mean a gamer, I mean board games, card games, sports, video games. Right. So the idea is that we all are gamers. We love games. It's very natural for us to like games. You don't have to be a hardcore gamer. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself right now. I have a studio. We run a studio of about 12 people. We make games for banks, for hospitals, for the classroom. So we're using the idea of games and you bring them into other kind of realms for something other than pure entertainment. So we can call them serious games. And I am the least gamer of everyone. I play Candy Crush. I did not play Farmville, but I did play Candy Crush. I like games like Heads Up. And my colleagues like them too, but I'm purely a casual gamer, whereas my colleagues play like mid-core games and hardcore games that take you hundreds of hours to complete. So I frequently look at myself and say, am I a real gamer? And really I am a real gamer, just like all of you. Just because you don't like hardcore games doesn't mean you're not a real gamer. So just to give you a kind of overview of what we're going to be doing today, I want to talk to you a little bit about like why should you care about games and video games. Talk about a short history of game studies, video game studies, as well as serious games, and then give you a few examples. And I'm hoping to give you kind of a framework that you can use to kind of talk about games with a little bit more on an academic side, because the fun, hopefully you just have fun playing games and you kind of get that experience personally when you play. So why should you care? Currently, based on the research, about 67% of households in North America are playing games. It's a lot. But it's not the 14-year-old boy in his basement that's playing games. It's 34 years old is about the average age for a gamer. And it's about 52% to 40% in terms of women playing games. That's not lost on the video game developers. Candy Crush was not targeted towards men. I played it, but I played it with a lot of grandmothers in the world and a lot of women, middle-aged women, and same with Farmville. These were two of the biggest grossing games in the past, 10 years, 12 years. So we're all playing games, we're all playing video games. Another kind of interesting number to look at is this idea of 10,000 hours. Malcolm Gladwell talks about it in terms of how do I become an expert. It takes about 10,000 hours. Jane McGonigal talks about people who play games. When they're considered themselves to be a gamer, they play about 10,000 hours worth of games from the age of, let's say, 5 to about 18. And that's also about the same amount of time that kids are spending in school. So I think the question we can ask ourselves is not should we be using video games or the benefits of video games, the advantages of video games for learning. It's really a question of how do we do that. So in terms of video game studies and how video games or games in general have been looked at by researchers, one of the first people to look at this was Johan Huizinga, who comes from the Netherlands. And what he looked at, or he kind of put forth his theory is that as animals are already playing, they play with each other to socialize and to learn how to survive. Same thing with humans. We have a very intimate link with play, but that he looked at play as kind of presupposing culture and actually generates culture. So if you talk about poetry, which really are playful work with words and language. Same thing with riddles, or if you look at the law and putting on a wig and dressing up in a courtroom that was also kind of born from our play. So we talked about how play kind of generates culture as opposed to culture generating play. He also was the person who brought up the first idea of this magic circle, so that life is pretty ordinary and boring, but when I go into a game, it becomes extraordinary. You know, it's not just kicking the ball into the goal. It's David versus Goliath. It's good versus evil. It's this narrative that kind of comes out of games where we lose track of time and we lose track of who we are. So it's the idea of getting into flow, which is also something that the magic circle was even before the idea of flow. So this guy was kind of very ahead of his time. Roger Caillois, who is a sociologue from France, he was one of the first people to talk about the difference between play and games, and play being exploratory, not many rules, not much competition, versus game, which was more strategic and there was kind of an end result. It's really interesting when I'm with you because one of the things I kind of understood through this conference, I don't play a musical instrument, I like to listen to music, but I don't create music. It's this idea of how playful music really is, and how close to gaming can become, and how you guys are really kind of bridging that gap in such an interesting way. So it's really, really fun to be here and to kind of have this new perspective on play and games, which I did not have before. So since then, we've had kind of an explosion in the world of video games. I think that it was around 1952 when the first video game came out, which was this Pong game, which is still pretty cool if you want to play a video game. And then since then, we've had different consoles that have come out. And just like in kind of writing, when the first writing was really a way to deal with accounting, and then the years that came after, we had Shakespeare, we had rap, and we had all these different kind of ways that we've used writing. Well, that's the same thing that's happening going on in video games. We've had video games for, let's say, about 60 years, so it's really a new field. And with the explosion of technological peripherals, whether they be haptics or virtual reality or wearables, augmented reality, the possibilities are limitless. So we're really at the beginning of what video games can do. This is very, very new. And same thing with video game studies. We started out with kind of looking at, video games are incredibly violent. If you look at this game called Death Race, you think, oh my gosh, how did my child ever play this game? It's going to just melt their brain. But when you actually look at the game, it wasn't very violent at all. So there was this kind of stereotype, which in a lot of ways wasn't legitimate. There were a lot of video games that were violent. But I think that looking at just the violence of video games is limiting, and it doesn't really harness all of the positive elements of video games that we can look at and we can use to, for instance, learn music. So today there's just an incredible amount of organizations, whether they be academic, not-for-profit, that are looking at video games and funding video game studies. It's, everyone here, you guys are all familiar with this. It's possible to get grants to do research with nationally funded organizations because I think people are coming to the realization that there are a lot of benefits with video games. So here's just a quick list of video game studies. It's obviously way too small, but if you want my PowerPoint, I can send it to you and you can read through them. You might already be familiar with them. And here's some of the reasons why video games are so powerful. This is not like school, which is somewhat obligatory and kind of fragmented. We're talking about experiences that are chosen by the user, that they are incredibly well designed so that they take someone from the idea of not knowing how to play it and they bring them on a learning curve, which is very, very well thought out and very well designed with a lot of user testing and player feedback. And you have this choice. I want to play a game. You can't force someone into a game. You can force them into a game. The game experience will be less good if that's the case. But the idea is really, how do I get my player to fall into the rabbit hole? That's the design term, which means how do I get my player to kind of want to play the game? And so if you can create an experience like that to learn music, for instance, it's something that's very, very powerful. So in terms of serious games, this is also a newer field that has a lot of cool things that are happening to it, but there's a lot of obstacles, which I don't know if I'll have time to go into today, but it's not a perfectly easy business. This is what I do for a living, and so I have an intimate understanding of that. But there are a lot of opportunities. When we talk about serious games, we frequently use this little diagram to kind of explain the idea of how interactivity with traditional textbooks and video games, as we kind of go towards the middle, we kind of are are able to merge them. So this is a visual representation. It's not the only way to think of serious games. It's just kind of a visual representation of that. And the first person to really come up with this definition of serious games, and this is just one term that's used. There's other terms. Serious games, they're called transformative games. They can be called applied games. They can be called educational games. All these terms are really pretty ugly, if you ask me. None of them are very sexy. And although it's not necessarily super important for things to be sexy, sometimes when they have a sexy name, it's easier for them to catch on. So there is a benefit to having a cooler name. And if anyone has any ideas out there, feel free to come to me. And I'd love to hear them because I almost hate the term serious game. Because games are not serious by nature, and that's the fun of them. But, so this is the term so far that we're stuck with. Hopefully we can do something with it. So Clark App was one of the first people to come up with the term serious games, and the way he described it was serious games have an explicit and carefully thought out educational purpose and are not intended to be played primarily for amusement. Some of his work was brought about through work that he did on some Cold War strategy war games, and that's where a lot of serious game work came from originally, was through the military. And this is the first person who came up with the definition, so the military and serious games, there is a link between those. Here's another game called Kriegspiel, which was used by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War around 1870, which was a strategy game to teach offense and defense, and so it was a way to kind of teach strategy through a game. Pierre de Coubertin, who was a French researcher and educator, he was the father of the modern day Olympics, and what he talked about was a lot of using games and athletics to create excellence in physical education and in education in general. So this is a way to look at games as not just, or serious games, not just as kind of video games and board games, but also as kinds of in terms of sports. And this is a game that you probably have all played before, but you may never have ever seen this version of it. Does anyone know this game? Monopoly. It was called the Landlord's Dilemma when it first came out around the turn of the century, around 1900, somewhere around there. And you might not like the game, but the design, the serious game design, was incredibly powerful because what Elizabeth Magie wanted to put forward was the idea that monopolies are not that effective. They're not that fun. And if you play the game, that's exactly what happens. There's one person who wins. It's a zero-sum game. It's incredibly competitive. The only thing you might be able to do if you're losing is cheat a little bit, which is also kind of what people do when there's a monopoly. So the game itself, you might say, it's not an incredible experience, but it is a very good learning tool or teaching tool. Around the 1990s, serious games and edutainment kind of became popular, but the designs were quite poor. This is a fraction game, if you will. So I do my multiple choice question, and if I get it right, I score a basket, and if I don't get it right, I miss the basket. So the mechanics of the game and the learning are totally separate, and it's not really that exciting. And this is maybe more gamification, but even that is not so well designed. Again, another relationship with the military. This is called America's Army, which was a game that came out, I think, around 2002. And it was a way for the United States military to, through a first-person shooter game, to teach people about what it's like to be in the Army, and it was a marketing tool. So we talk about serious games. They can be educational, but they can also be used for marketing. They can also be used for help. They can be used for a lot of different terms, or a lot of different domains. And then we get to around 2005 when two other researchers from the United States simplified the definition. So it's a game whose ultimate goal is something other than pure entertainment. If you remember, Clark App talked about the design and the purpose of the design and all these things. These two researchers just simplified it, which in some ways is good, but then in other ways it's not so good. So if you look at, for instance, SimCity and Civilization, these games are pure entertainment games, but you get a lot out of them. I actually work with a lot of different entrepreneurs, and it's very interesting, but a lot of entrepreneurs love SimCity, like very successful entrepreneurs play SimCity, and I don't know if it's a cause and effect or a correlation, but maybe if there is some kind of relationship between being a successful entrepreneur and playing SimCity, maybe SimCity should be in schools. Obviously, that's a question for another day. I have like another 5 minutes, so I don't think we can get into that, but it is a question that I think is an interesting question to So in terms of serious games taxonomy, this is something that is we're formalizing as we go, so we can talk about games for marketing, games for healthcare. This is a growing field, but the issue that we all struggle with is that it's already hard to make a good entertainment game. Add on to that the fact that you've got to learn something, or it's somehow got to transform you, or you've got to apply to something else, makes the task even harder. So, you know, if you look at the number of games on the App Store, I don't know how many there are, there's got to be a million of them. How many of them are good? I don't know, 25. So then you take that same kind of math and you apply it to learning. It's very, very difficult. And then selling those games, I know that maybe many of you out there just say, oh, I want it to be free, I want it to be free. Free is cool, I'm down with that, but it's hard to then maintain it, it's hard to improve on the game, it's hard to then make a second game afterwards. So it is a tough business to be in. It's a fun business to be in because you can be really passionate about your job, but it's not always economically the most feasible line of work to be in. So quickly, I don't know exactly how much time I have. I have maybe another 3 or 4 minutes. I just want to give you a few examples of some serious games. This is one of the best games I find in the world of serious games or educational games. It's the game on the right. It's called Slice Fractions. It comes from the mechanic, like a slicing mechanic, which is a mechanic that was very popular out of mobile games. It comes from like a game like Fruit Ninja. And the idea is that in Slice Fractions, I slice up lava to burn away the ice that's on the bottom, and then my little woolly mammoth on the left side of the screen can move to the right hand side of the screen. And so this game was made by a Montreal company and it's sold on the App Store. I don't make any money from this, but you should buy it because it's a really great game. And the idea is that slowly but surely the player is introduced to fractions without any numbers, and slowly but surely the numbers come into the screen. And they did a research study on this, and it was really interesting because they found that 3 hours of playing this game took students' levels of understanding of fractions from a 3rd grade to a 4th grade level. And then they also did a comparison between just playing the game and taking a class with a teacher and just playing a class. The 2 game scenarios outperformed just the teacher, and the best performance by the students was with the teacher and with the game. So the idea of kind of replacing the teacher is not something that we're trying to promote, and the research is kind of bearing that out. It's just kind of a tool that we can use. So serious games are not going to solve an entire issue. They're not going to somehow like make the world better, but they can be part of the solution. Is kind of the way we like to talk about it. So here's Remission, which was a game that helped younger people with cancer understand their disease better, and there was a research study that showed that there was improved health outcomes after playing the game. Fat World was a way to help people understand that their choices in eating and exercise. You run like a little restaurant in a community, and you help people in your community to eat better or worse, or exercise more or less, and then you've got kind of an understanding of how your actions had consequences in terms of people's weight. So it was kind of an interesting way to play health as opposed to just read about it or talk about it. Quandary is a game that talks about ethics, so it's very similar ethical questions that we have on Earth, except they just put it on a different planet and they kind of make a few of the things different, so that it's kind of easier to talk about these ethical issues with a kind of a little bit of distance. And we talked a little bit yesterday about Folded, which was using games to create a way to look at folding proteins in a way that algorithms were not doing so. It was, I think, the University of Washington, and they brought together kind of a bunch of researchers and said, well, how can we outperform an algorithm? How can we get people to be involved in folding up different proteins so that we have an understanding of what are the best ways to fold protein to prevent disease? And it turned out that using games to do that, they got like 57,000 people to play it. Using games was a great way to bring in players. So if we look at the idea of serious games, well, it's a game whose goal is something other than pure entertainment. This here is not only do I get to learn a little bit about folding, but it's also a way to help researchers. So I use games to help researchers answer a question. So it wasn't just pure entertainment, but it was a way to help researchers answer a question. So that's it. I'm going to do a shameless little plug here. If you like serious games and you're interested in learning more about serious games, we have an awesome conference coming up in July in Montreal. called the Serious Play Conference. It's usually happens in the United States. This is the first time we're bringing it up to Canada. It's going to be in Montreal. We are going to have different people present. We're bringing in researchers from around the world. Katie Salem, who's an incredible game design researcher. She's coming in. We're in the process of getting Ubisoft to come in and do one-of-a-kind presentation on all the different serious games that they work on. So if you're interested in this, you can go to Serious Play Conference, I think it is, .com, and you can find it, and you can ask me for any other information that you might have, or any questions you might have. But that's it for me. I think I came in under time. I know I went a little fast, but I just wanted to give you an overview, and you can definitely see my slides later. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, have yourself a great day.
Thank you very much, Avery. Questions about serious games? Yes, Amy?
What do you think of the use of those games in the early development to children?
Using serious games or which game?
Yeah. What do you think of if an entrepreneur would like to get someone that shares serious game for digital box?
Well, honestly, the best example would be slice fraction. So it's like 3rd and 4th grade. If you're talking about younger than that, there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of games that are on the market already. I don't know. I think a lot of them aren't very good at what they say that they're supposed to do, and so you have a design issue, and then there also is kind of like a business model issue, right? I've got to kind of get the kids to play more, and so there's an issue with some of that stuff. With that said, a well-designed game that has a business model that makes sense, I think can be very, very positive. This is the best example of it. Obviously, it's not early. I don't know exactly what you mean by early. 4 or 5 years old.
Is there something with the environment, or is there?
There are some. There's games that are made by a Swedish company, and they make called Dragon Math, which is kind of a way to teach kids about algebra, but way early. So it's kind of like a fun way to do it. It's a game that's sold very, very well. It's tough though, because you've got issues with screen time. You've got issues.
Yes. So there's a lot of research about this, but there's some traffic, some people that online with it, so that actually that has no conditions not until your point of view in the book.
If it's well designed, she's asking if it's like, what is my opinion about the games that are used for younger kids, 4 to 5 years old. If it's well designed and it has an educational outcome that's either been researched or can be proven, I think that it's valuable, but it's not a serious game that's a problem. If you're talking about screen time, which is a way bigger problem. If you're talking about interaction with your phone, which is a way bigger problem. Serious games are like a small part of that. So a well-designed game can be positive, but it's not as positive.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yes, Andrea?
So, thank you very much for your presentation about this. All right, okay. Hello, all on YouTube. So I'm wondering what the opposite of a serious game is. It a frivolous game or so I was thinking about that, and also thinking about like in learning and teaching, often, almost always, there are unintended learning. So we can, whether we're using a game or not, as teachers, we can never be sure what our students are receiving. And I imagine it must be the same with serious games. So we can have an intended learning outcome, but there might be a whole, we can never be sure that what we think we're delivering is actually being received, okay? So I'm wondering if, like I think you touched on it a little bit with the Sims example. So you wouldn't call it a serious game, so it's some other kind of game. But there might be all kinds of learning that the designer never intended. So then, like, isn't there a sort of, how do you deal with that tension? And is it really useful to have these categories? It's a bit like, it was making me think about sort of informal and formal education and all of those kind of boxes that we create, and how in real life it's much more complex and messy than that. And I wonder if that is an issue in the gaming world.
I think that's a complicated issue. I think the only thing I would say is this, for instance, if you look at Folded, it's it was not made for entertainment. It was really, we need to get people to fold proteins, and by folding proteins, we're going to see if we can beat an algorithm to make folding that's more effective than an algorithm. So the idea is that a serious game, the term does apply pretty well here. It just becomes messy in that gray area where it's, Civilization or SimCity, is it a serious game? Is it an entertainment game? I do think the term is useful, but it's an ugly term and it's not a perfect term either. There's a lot of gray area.
Another question?
Yeah, it's not much of a question, it's more like a hint. There's a lot of similitude in between rhythm, figures, music, and fraction. I think there would be something to develop, this kind of game, this lava slicing game. You can maybe mix it with the music rhythm figure and say that to a lot of music teacher. I think it would work. Maybe there's something to develop there.
I mean, the slicing again, you could integrate that into music, somehow music learning?
Yeah, I think there would be something to develop with that.
It is a very popular, or at least it was a very popular game mechanic, so it won't go away. Fruit Ninja is a cool game, and so if you think it can work, it's definitely something that you should try out.
Okay.
Thank you. Another question?
Yes. It's more an addition about what you said, Andrea. It's an addition of what you're saying. Mais je vais le dire en français. C'est un peu comme avec ce qu'on s'était dit. C'est que, vous m'aviez mentionné, M. Dubé, que l'intention d'un jeu de divertissement, c'est pas comme un jeu sérieux. Du jeu de divertissement, on dit ça? Entertainment game. The purpose is not a serious game, so it's not. Il n'y a pas comme d'intention apprentissage des trucs pédagogiques, mais ça ne veut pas dire qu'il n'y a pas nécessairement des apprentissages qui se feront, ou qui se font. So it's not the purpose, but by this game, even if it's not a serious game, they can learn something. But I find it interesting that she told us there's like closed box serious game and non-serious game, but we can learn even things.
Yes, I agree. It's not a perfect term and it's not a perfect box, but I think that the term has some value. How much value is debatable, and we can maybe debate that for we're all learning about. Good.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have a coffee break. Thank you very much.